So, ladies and gentlemen, the lawyers will now make opening statements. The purpose of an opening statement is to give the lawyers an opportunity to tell you what they expect the evidence will show, so that you will better understand the evidence as it is introduced during the trial. I must caution you, however, that the opening statements are not evidence. Mr. Lissay?
Thank you, Your Honor. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen of the jury. I appreciate that you all showed up today. This is obviously extraordinary times, and we're taking extraordinary measures here in the courtroom to make sure that everybody feels safe. And I appreciate that you showed up and that you're willing to hear this case. It's very important to the state. It's very important to Mr. Cayer that you do that. As the court indicated, the purpose of an opening statement is to sort of provide a guide map or an outline for where we think the case is going to go. It's not an opportunity to make arguments at this point, and my statements aren't evidence. They merely introduce to you what I think the evidence will show. Sitting at counsel table is highly unusual for me during an opening statement. As the court indicated, we're taking measures to make sure everything can be heard. If you are at all having trouble hearing me or understanding what I'm saying because of the mask or because of the lack of volume or whatever it may be, please raise your hand and alert the court and let us know. You're here today to hear the case of the state of Wisconsin versus Jacob Cayer. What you will hear is that on June 7th, 2016, Jacob Cayer turned 1368 Riverdale Drive in the village of Hobart into a real-life horror movie. Sabrina Teague and her live-in boyfriend Joel Kennedy, they walked on the scene of that horror movie at 8 p.m. that night. When they entered the home through the garage door, Sabrina walked into the home. They could hear the shower running in the bathroom. Sabrina walked to the first floor bathroom where her mother's dead and badly beaten body was located. She took out her phone to call 911, started walking back toward the kitchen area where Joel was located. Mr. Cayer jumped out of the door in the laundry room and attacked them with a knife. This is a real-life horror movie description. Mr. Cayer attacked both Sabrina and Joel in the living room. Joel Kennedy is an eyewitness to this event who survived the brutal attack from Mr. Cayer. Not unharmed, mind you, but with significant injuries himself. A struggle ensued in the kitchen. Mr. Kennedy was able to go outside to the garage and grab a snow shovel. The struggle continued in the garage area as Sabrina and Mr. Cayer poured out into the garage. Joel struck Mr. Cayer in the face with the shovel. There are physical injuries consistent with that. Mr. Cayer went to the ground and Mr. Kennedy ran back in the house. He closed the door to the garage. He ran past the bathroom where Heesun Teague lay dead, into Heesun's room where he closed the door and locked it, into Heesun's bathroom in her master bedroom where he closed the door and locked it, and he called 911. You will hear that 911 call. You'll hear the panic in his voice. You'll hear him huffing and puffing, explaining how blood is spurting out of his arm. Joel Kennedy had been stabbed with a kitchen knife that went in one side, out the other, and into his chest. As he lay on the floor in the kitchen before getting up, kicking Mr. Cayer off, and having the struggle ensue. He knew that Sabrina had been left with Mr. Cayer in the garage area of the home. Sabrina eventually opened the garage door, and the struggle ensued and poured out of the garage into the driveway area, into some foliage and trees outside the residence. There is a blood trail leading. There's a blood trail everywhere. This entire house is covered with blood. There's a blood trail leading from the garage down the driveway into a tree line and into the backyard of the neighbor's residence where Sabrina's body was located by law enforcement officers just minutes later. The knife, covered in Sabrina's blood, is located in that tree line by law enforcement officers the next day. Exactly where Mr. Cayer diagrammed it in a map of his confession to law enforcement. This is a real-life horror movie, ladies and gentlemen. It is not a mystery. We know exactly who caused these deaths. We know exactly what happened. Unlike many cases, this is not a situation where it's a whodunit. There is an eyewitness to the events that transpired, Joel Kennedy. Mr. Cayer is found by law enforcement about 30 minutes after their arrival, hiding in the woods behind the house covered in blood, where he's found by a canine unit from the Brown County Sheriff's Office. He is arrested. He is brought to the hospital where he gives a detailed, many-hour confession to Sergeant Holzbach of the Brown County Sheriff's Office. DNA evidence is located on the knife, confirming that that was the knife that killed Sabrina Teague. Detailed DNA evidence is found on a tire iron located inside the house, which confirms that Heesun Teague's blood is located on the curved end of that tire iron, and DNA consistent with Mr. Cayer is found on the handle. Sabrina Teague's blood is located on swabs from Mr. Cayer's hands, both of them. This is not a whodunit, ladies and gentlemen. You have an eyewitness, you're found on the scene covered in blood, a confession, and DNA evidence. Over the course of the next few days, the state will present a number of witnesses to you to demonstrate that Mr. Cayer committed these offenses. As indicated, you will hear first the 911 call. You will hear Joel Kennedy calling 911 and explaining to them what happened, that they were attacked in their home. You will hear them identifying it as Jake and identifying Mr. Cayer as Sabrina's ex-boyfriend. Joel will explain to you how he had met Jake on one prior occasion at Walmart. There was a brief argument between Mr. Cayer and Sabrina, but he was able to identify then Mr. Cayer as Sabrina's ex-boyfriend. He will tell you Mr. Cayer had never been to the home during the 7 months that he lived with Sabrina at that residence. In addition to Mr. Kennedy's statement about what happened, you will hear about how law enforcement officers arrived on the scene shortly thereafter. They came upon the scene making a tactical approach based on the nature of the call that came in from Mr. Kennedy, that it was a weapons call. The officers who approached from the right side of the residence walked up into the neighbor's backyard where they saw Sabrina's body lying in the backyard. They rolled her over and attempted to administer aid, but she was deceased. After that, other officers made contact with Mr. Kennedy at the front door of the residence, cleared the residence, walked Mr. Kennedy out of the residence where he was cooperative with law enforcement. He was removed to emergency services. Officers cleared the residence and began a perimeter search for Mr. Cayer. Shortly thereafter, officers located Mr. Cayer on scene. He was taken into custody by the officers, brought to a clearing where he was searched. His pockets were emptied. In his pockets, there was rope, cord. In his pockets was Sabrina's cell phone. His clothes were covered in blood. The officers will tell you that his pants, his shirt, a mask or a head covering that he had, all had significant blood staining on them. Mr. Cayer was transported to the hospital and gave a detailed statement to Sergeant Holzbach and Sergeant Yankee of the Brown County Sheriff's Office. It's not a situation where after 12 hours of being grilled, he finally said, yeah, I did it, you got me. It is a detailed statement that indicates many aspects of this that are corroborated by the forensic evidence recovered on scene and the photographs that are taken by the state crime lab when they come to that scene. He talks about the water running. Both the shower and the sink in the bathroom where Heesun Teague's body were both running when law enforcement arrived. You can hear it on the 911 tape. Officers will tell you that they turned that off. Mr. Cayer can talk about washing himself and washing his feet during his statement. Socks are recovered in the sink of that bathroom with Heesun Teague's blood on them. Mr. Cayer is barefoot when he's recovered by law enforcement officers. He talks about stabbing. There is a video. You will see a video of Mr. Cayer taking a pen and reenacting the stabbing motion toward Sabrina Teague's neck and upper torso, consistent with a large stab wound to Sabrina Teague's neck, which unfortunately you will have to see in the photographs from the medical examiner. He will talk about, in addition to the stabbing, that there was blunt force injuries, that he recalls swinging a hammer or an object like a hammer, not a hammer, but something like a hammer. He recalls swinging that. He believes in the bathroom, consistent with the tire iron recovered, and the significant blunt force injuries to Heesun Teague that you will observe. He talks about riding his bike to the scene. He talks about putting on his headphones and getting angry and getting worked up listening to Hollywood Undead. You will find that his bike is recovered on scene. Officers noticed it in the tree line as they made the approach from the left-hand side. They photographed his bike turned over on scene. You will note that there's an open window outside of Sabrina's bedroom, clearly visible from the outside of the home that the window is ajar, and then from the inside that window is broken. There's grass inside as if that was the area for forced entry. You will also learn that officers recovered a backpack on scene, a backpack filled with miscellaneous items, Mr. Cayer's identification card, his driver's license inside that backpack, along with knives, scrapers, a rusty railroad spike, a hammer that is duct taped and fashioned as a weapon with a carabiner on it. There are zip ties recovered in the residence by Heesun Teague's body, consistent with the zip ties found in Mr. Cayer's backpack. The tire iron used to kill Heesun Teague is wrapped in duct tape. There's a roll of duct tape in Mr. Cayer's backpack. There's duct tape around that hammer with the carabiner fashioned as a weapon. He details the rage that he has and the anger that he felt that night, that he had been in an argument, that he rode to that scene angry. He provides a diagram of where these events took place to law enforcement. The law enforcement officer taking his statement had not been to the scene. This was a Hobart Lawrence scene where DCI, the Division of Criminal Investigation for the state, was on scene. The sergeant who took the statement had not been out there. They were relaying some information back and forth, but he had very little information. They had not found the knife. Mr. Cayer provided a diagram outlining exactly where the knife would be located, and that's right where they found it. And he recalls Sabrina being stabbed in some foliage, completely consistent with the crime scene that we located as she stumbled out from the garage into the driveway, into that tree line where there's blood staining, and into the neighbor's backyard. When you hear that statement to Sergeant Holzbach, you'll hear parts of it. You'll hear Sergeant Holzbach talk about the statement, and then you will actually hear parts of it. And you will see the reenactment. And then you will see the evidence from the crime lab. You will see the pictures from the scene corroborating the information given in that statement. It will be abundantly clear to you that Mr. Cayer is the person who caused the death of Heesun and Sabrina Teague, and that he did so with intent to kill them. And again, you will hear then from the crime lab, from the DNA analyst, who will confirm. You'll hear DNA evidence isn't perfect. And we talked about this in voir dire. There's blood all over this house, right? And the crime lab isn't going to test 300 samples of blood from every different location in that house. The purpose of DNA is to identify who is our perpetrator. With Sabrina Teague's blood on his hands, literally, her blood on the knife, DNA consistent with Mr. Cayer and Heesun Teague on the tire iron. The DNA evidence that was tested is consistent and confirms what an eyewitness told you and what Mr. Cayer himself confessed to. At the end of this case, you will be presented with all the facts, but you'll also be presented then with jury instructions. Those jury instructions outline the elements that the state has to prove beyond a reasonable doubt. As we discussed briefly at voir dire, the elements for first-degree intentional homicide are relatively straightforward. Did Mr. Cayer cause their death? And did he do so with intent to kill? Both will be abundantly clear after you hear the evidence in this case. For all the reasons I stated above, we know our perpetrator. He himself admitted to it. We have an eyewitness. There's DNA. He's found on scene covered in blood. It doesn't get any simpler than that in terms of who committed these offenses. His intent to kill is likewise clear. You will hear from the medical examiner about the abundant, vicious injuries these two women suffered. There can be no other intent when you stab someone 10 times or more. There can be no other intent when you batter someone so badly with a tire iron and stab them and have them hanging by a rope in the bathroom. What else could Mr. Cayer's intent have been but to kill those two women? Likewise with Joel. You won't be asked whether he caused the injury, whether he attempted to do this, and whether he intended to kill Joel. Joel has a gaping wound in his arm from a through-and-through stab from a large kitchen knife that went into his chest. The amount of force necessary to clear through someone's arm and then through the chest, what other intent could he have had at that moment but to kill Joel Kennedy? It will be abundantly clear to you when you hear the evidence in this case. And you'll also hear about some of the other collateral crimes that are associated with this that are for your consideration here. And that is burglary. He's charged with burglary or entering a residence with the intent to commit a felony. He clearly entered the residence. You're able to see the area in Sabrina's room where he entered without their consent. They weren't home. Broke through a bedroom window. And obviously his crimes that he committed in terms of killing them and attempting to kill Joel are his felony offenses that he attempted. That was his intent in entering that residence that day. And then finally, there are 2 counts of bail jumping. Meaning Mr. Cayer was on bond in 2 other criminal cases. One of the standard conditions of bond in those cases is that you cannot commit any other criminal offenses while on bond. You can be released from custody, but there is a statutory condition that you cannot commit crimes while released on bond. So if you find Mr. Cayer guilty of committing the homicides and committing the burglary, committing the attempted homicide, if you find him guilty of any one of those, he naturally is also guilty of the bail jumping because he was on bond in those 2 criminal cases at this time. You will also hear about a jury instruction about reasonable doubt, proof beyond a reasonable doubt. That is the highest burden in the criminal justice system. It's the highest burden in our entire justice system. That the state must prove to you that there is evidence to support each element of these crimes beyond a reasonable doubt. We are confident that if you listen carefully to the evidence in this case, and you give a fair and impartial consideration of that evidence, that you will clearly find that the state has met its burden of proof with respect to each of those elements beyond a reasonable doubt. And that is what we ask of you here today. That you give a fair and impartial consideration of all of the evidence that will come before you over the next few days, that you consider it carefully in deliberations, and that you render the only verdict that we think is possible in this case, the only verdict, the only reasonable inference in this case, the only reasonable hypothesis in this case is that Mr. Cayer committed these crimes and that he intended to commit these crimes, and that you will find him guilty. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lasay. Mr. Cotton?
Is it okay to move this barricade when I talk to the jury, Your Honor?
Well, I can't guarantee we have our social distancing otherwise, but I think that for that limited purpose, if Mr. Johnson is okay with that,
I'm
you
fine
could
with
just
that.
pull it right to the front of the table then.
Good morning, everybody. Can everybody hear me okay? I wanted to start by thanking everybody for being here for this very important case. As the state indicated, you're here today to decide whether Mr. Cayer is responsible for these crimes, and I'm not going to get into the details of the offenses because you just heard a little bit of an overview. What I do want to mention is that opening statements are not evidence. Opening statements are simply the, and that's why you're not taking notes right now, opening statements are simply the observations of the attorneys. Evidence is what you hear in court. Evidence is what you hear from witnesses who take the stand. Evidence is what you hear when, whether it's an expert witness or a police officer witness, evidence is what you hear when an individual comes in here and offers their observations to you. We have a system of justice in this country that I think is the best in the world, and it's a very important system of justice. Defendants are presumed innocent at all stages of the proceedings. You probably heard about that in your personal lives, and we talked about that a little bit in jury selection. But every defendant is presumed innocent under the law. And that presumption of innocence remains with the defendant, with Mr. Cayer. The presumption of innocence remains throughout the whole trial, only until such time if the state is able to introduce evidence beyond a reasonable doubt. The reason why we have such a standard is because defendants are not required to prove their innocence. In other words, some systems have a requirement that a person come into court and start putting on evidence to show why they didn't do a particular crime. That's not the system that our founding fathers created here in America. They created a system where a defendant is presumed innocent, and you as jurors, despite what you might hear in opening statement, are required to follow that very important principle and remember at all times that you are to presume that Mr. Cayer is innocent of these very, very serious crimes. We'd ask that as you sit here through this trial, this will be a multi-day trial, we're sure of that. I think the parties will work very hard to make sure we can move the case along for you as efficiently as possible, because it's important that things that we can agree on, we'll try our best to agree on those things, but there will be a number of points that we don't agree on, of course, in which time there will be cross-examination of witnesses. Jacob Cayer is the defendant here. Back on Friday when we did our jury selection, we talked a little bit about a defendant testifying, and I had mentioned during jury selection that, of course, a defendant has a constitutional right not to testify. That is a right. So a defendant has sort of two rights in that vein: the right to choose not to testify, but the other end of that coin is that the defendant has the right to testify. And this may very well be a case where, in addition to cross-examining the state's witnesses that they put on, this may very well be a case where Mr. Cayer will choose to testify and give his version of events for you folks. So I want you to keep an open mind throughout the entire case that you're hearing, because the state has the right to go first. They're the ones that get to introduce the first witnesses. But then we have an opportunity after the state has, they say, rested, we have an opportunity to present witnesses if we might choose to do so, including at a second phase of the trial if it ever got to that. But of course, in the first phase of the trial, Mr. Cayer as a witness testifying about his version of events. The most important thing from our perspective, folks, is that you keep an open mind throughout these proceedings. We hope that all of you can follow your oath very seriously by remembering that Mr. Cayer is presumed innocent at all stages of the proceeding, keeping an open mind about what you're hearing, and realizing that in many cases, you've heard the expression, there's two sides to every story. I would go so far as to say there's oftentimes a bigger picture of what's happening, and sometimes we have to think very carefully about what the bigger picture is when we're making the decisions that are so important in this case. And I would urge you to remember that there's always a bigger picture at play that we believe will, by the end of these proceedings, the end of this week, will be evident to you folks, and you'll find Mr. Cayer not guilty. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Cotton.